Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, good afternoon. Good afternoon, listeners. It is a cloudy day here in suburban Chicago. The weather is actually quite pleasant. I would say it's low 70s for temperature, which is very comfortable for walk-in weather. And with the sun with it being a little cloudy, I don't even feel like, blasted with sunlight or anything. It's a very nice day. I thought I would use this very nice day to talk a little bit about a couple of games I've played recently that I've played a fair number of times. And I went and looked in my show archives, and I cannot believe it, but I have done a deep dive about neither of these. So I thought it was time for a good old-fashioned board game duel here on Pick Up and Deliver. And I thought I would talk about two games that I hear compared to one another all the flippin' time. And that is Underwater Cities and Terraforming Mars. So that's right, it's time for a Message from the Deep duel. All right. So generally the way these duel episodes work is that I pick 5 or so thematic ideas and talk about them in the context of these games. And I let you think a little bit about how these games fit for you. When I talk about the games as a duel, I generally think about which game do I like better. This is going to be a tough one, but it's also going to raise lots of interesting points. So buckle in, here we go. Terraforming Mars versus Underwater Cities. Let's start with a quick summary of the games. Terraforming Mars is a game from 2016, I believe, by Jacob Frixelius and the Frixelius family, published by Stronghold Games. In this game, you play a super corporation working against the clock and against other super corporations to terraform the planet of Mars. The game is played over a series of rounds, each of which is called a generation in the game. And in each generation, you're going to enact different kinds of actions and spend cards and do a variety of things to work on the project of terraforming Mars. The game ends when the atmosphere of Mars the oxygen content in the atmosphere has been raised to 14%, when the heat of the planet of Mars has been raised to, I think, 10 degrees Celsius or 8 degrees Celsius, and when enough water has been produced, the planet starts to feel like, I guess, watery. At the end of the game, players get points for building cities and forests. They get points for a variety of different cards they might have put into play, and they get points for a couple different endgame bonuses, which are selected by the players during the game. It is a tableau combo building game with some card drafting and some board placement, and it takes usually around 3 hours to play, give or take. So that's Terraforming Mars. Underwater Cities, by Vladimir Suchi and published by Delicious Games, is a tableau building game in which players are producing a sort of civilization of underwater cities in the future because we need more room for people to live in. In the game, you are playing over a series of 10 eras, which include 3 production rounds. And during that time, you're going to be building your underwater cities. You'll be connecting them to the coasts. You'll be building a variety of different kinds of support facilities around the cities. And you'll be scoring points for a variety of different things, including some endgame scoring cards that you select. It's a tableau building game in which you're managing an array of different resources and managing your economy and your production. So these games are often referred to in the same breath. When Underwater Cities came out, the most common comparison I heard people make was to Terraforming Mars. And I think that there are enough overlapping elements in the kinds of things that you do during the game that I can absolutely see why people make that comparison. That said, I don't feel like these games are identical. And so, in my experience, it feels like both games are perfectly viable as as games in your collection, and that playing one doesn't automatically feel like playing another, in the same way that If I want to play Seven Wonders and I want to play It's a Wonderful World, those games are very similar to the point that, playing one satisfies the itch for the other. I feel like Underwater Cities and Terraforming Mars are a bit different in that regard. All right, so generally what I do in the duel is I pick out 5 different aspects of the game and compare that element in each game and talk about which one I find more satisfying. And I will say I haven't really thought through this ahead of time. So these are kind of off the cuff. I thought through the 5 elements, but I haven't thought through what I'm going to say about each. So let's begin with cards. Both games involve a ton of card play. In Terraforming Mars, you get 4 cards each round. You start with 10 cards, and then you get 4 cards each round. Each card that you keep throughout the whole game, you have to pay 3 mega credits to keep. So you're constantly balancing between the opportunity cost of keeping a card that you're balancing between the opportunity cost of keeping a card that you're going to buy and paying the $3 versus, losing the opportunity to use that card, but still having the $3. So it's sort of inevitable, unless you're incredibly good at the game, that you're going to have some cards that you'll take that you don't end up using, which is wasted money. Or you may, like me, be somebody who always finds the allure of more cards exciting, and so you end up putting into place a number of elements of the game that add to your hand and allow you to feel like you have more cards to play, which is something I really enjoy doing, but maybe is counterproductive. I don't often win large games of Terraforming Mars. In Underwater Cities, contrary-wise, you draw 1 card every round, and it's not at all uncommon to get additional cards. Sometimes you draw 1 or 2 extra cards because of different actions you take or different cards you play. And then you also get 3 new cards each era when the card decks shift. This is one of the major differences between the 2 games. In Underwater Cities, we have multiple card decks, and you're picking we switch decks as the game goes through the era. So when the game has gone for 1/3 of the game, we switch card decks. And then when the game has gone for a second third, we switch to card decks again. In Terraforming Mars, all the cards come out at the beginning, which means that you could encounter cards at the beginning of Terraforming Mars that you can't possibly use until the end. It's a card you can't play until oxygen is at 4%. Well, the oxygen starts at 0 or maybe it's a card you can't play until oxygen is at 12%. So it's got to be played in the last couple rounds. So in both games, card play is an essential aspect of the game. In both games, you cycle through quite a few cards and you have a lot of options. I think in this game, in both games, the art on the cards is pretty mediocre. The art depicts what you're looking for. In Underwater Cities, the art is okay, but it also repeats on a lot of cards. So there's lots of cards where you have the same art as on another card, and it depicts some of what's going on, but it's pretty mediocre. By contrast, on Terraforming Mars, the art is different on each card, but a lot of the art is really subpar, and I think reflects a pretty poor approach to art design. So in both cases, the art sort of fails in the cards. I think in this case, I'm going to give the edge to Underwater Cities for 2 reasons. One, we don't have any cards in Terraforming Mars that are in Underwater Cities that directly attack the other players, and I like that. 2, the differentiation of 3 decks in Underwater Cities means that it's more likely you get cards you want when you want them. It's less likely that you have to spend a lot of time holding a card you don't want. Plus, I think the brutal decision of you're never allowed to have more than 3 cards in your hand, unless you get the card that lets you have 4, but whatever. You're stuck with 3 cards in your hand, which means at the beginning of every turn before you play a card, you have to discard. You might have to discard cards if you've drawn extra, and that's a delicious bit of viciousness that I think works really well. On to theme. I think the theme of Terraforming Mars is better. Both games they develop their theme really well. In both games, the actions you take thematically connect to the things that you're doing. Terraforming Mars has very descriptive events on their cards. Underwater City is a little less so. And frankly, I find Terraforming Mars a much more reasonable idea as a thing that we might do as humanity. The idea that we'll build domed cities underwater, I just don't see us doing it. So I think from that perspective, Terraforming Mars strikes me as much more reasonable, and I find the theme really great. Although I do really like the theme of Underwater Cities, and I think the components are really fun. We'll come back to that. So depth of play. Both games are really deep. Terraforming Mars, especially once you've mixed in a couple expansions, gets very involved. Lots of different choices, lots of different ways that you can go. You can focus on tableaus of cards. You can focus on controlling the board, areas of the board. You have to decide when to invest in the different milestones or the different awards, and getting those really does affect your final score as well. You know, Underwater Cities has a similar thing. You have to pay attention to the rhythm of the eras. You have to decide if you want to buy some of those end game scoring cards, when you're going to spend opportunity, when you spend turns to do that, and have those pay off. It works really nicely. So the games have comparable depth. I would probably call this a tie for that one. The next part of the game I would talk about is the feeling that the game gives me. This part is trickier. I have often talked about Vladimir Suchy as the master of my favorite kind of feeling in a game, which is the not quite enough. Terraforming Mars does that very well as well. When you're really trying to figure out how to do a thing, you really have a card you want to play, the other thing you want to do, you just can't do it because you don't have quite enough of this resource or that resource. Terraforming Mars also has a really interesting resource economy in which you're managing several different types of things that you might use to do the work you want to do in the game. And you have to kind of manage how much of each are you getting, and you're constantly kind of weighing the trade-offs. The same thing happens in Underwater Cities. As you figure out how much of different kinds of resources you're producing and what you're able to do with those resources once the production phase happens. Like I said, I think the vicious decision of only 3 cards in hand at the beginning of your turn is the really clever part that makes Underwater Cities shine for me a little bit more. I think in that regard, the feeling that I get, the feeling of the puzzle at work in Underwater Cities is maybe one level higher for me and pushes Underwater Cities a little bit above Terraforming Mars, but both are quite strong in that regard. So the last thing I wanted to mention in terms of different things one might focus on would be components. Both games come with a variety of different components. In Terraforming Mars, you get a large selection of sort of metallic colored cubes, and you get colorful player cubes that in Terraforming Mars you get the metallic currency cubes that you use throughout the game to mark numbers of things in different values. You also get your player cubes. You get these tiles that cover the cities, and you get the player cards. In general, the resources or the things you get in the game are okay, but they're subpar. The metallic counting cubes, for instance, are pretty junky. They're metallic, they're not metal. By contrast, I think the Underwater Cities is pretty good. The little plastic domes that you get for the cities and the different tokens for the different building types and the tunnels and whatnot are all pretty great. The biggest downside in Underwater Cities is the very thin player boards that you get, which would be a problem, except that Terraforming Mars also has ridiculously thin player boards, so that's a wash in terms of quality of components. Now, I will say with upgrades, both games have created a secondary market where you could buy upgraded components, including Underwater Cities sells dual layer player boards, as does Terraforming Mars. So while both games do have substantial missteps in terms of the player boards, I think Terraforming Mars is a clear downgrade compared to Underwater Cities, which Underwater Cities is generally pretty good. So in that regard, in card play, I think I said Underwater Cities because of the gradation of cards. In theme, Terraforming Mars wins for me. In depth, I think it's a wash. In feeling, I like Underwater Cities a little bit better than Terraforming Mars. And in components, clearly Underwater Cities is the victor. So by that setup, then Underwater Cities is our clear winner in the duel between Terraforming Mars and Underwater Cities. I do want to offer one caveat though. Both games are excellent, and I highly recommend both games if you find this sort of thing interesting. Also, the one big element that I did not talk about here is player interaction. Underwater Cities, the player interaction is almost entirely worker placement based, so the interaction comes from me taking the space you wanted. By contrast, the Terraforming Mars does have interaction in terms of taking a space you wanted on the map, on the player mat, by placing a city there or something, It also has interaction in the card drafting, which is an optional rule, but is pretty common among experienced Terraforming Mars players. And then most importantly, it does have direct conflict cards that allow you to interact directly with another player, which is not something that is part of the Underwater Cities oeuvre. So if player interaction were something on which I was rating the games, Terraforming Mars would come in higher. Well, thanks for joining me today. Hopefully you found this comparison of these two titans interesting. If you have stuff to say about Terraforming Mars or Underwater Cities, please head over to Board Game Geek to Guild 3269 and join the conversation there. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can send me a direct message, brendan@rattleboxgames.com for email, or wombat929 on Board Game Geek. Thanks for joining me today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.